Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Yvonne. I'm a Nigerian and I'm joining you today from Namibia. I'm the moderator of today's digital dialogue, and for the benefit of those who are blind or visually impaired, all speakers will begin with a short self introduction. Digital Dialogue is a series of panel discussion exploring civil society's perspective on the emerging digital world. And the topic before us today is techno-authoritarianism, just another dystopian idea. The panel will examine the concept of cyber fascism and techno authoritarianism, which has recently gained more attention as they describe how governments in liberal democracies use digital technologies to increase control over their citizens. To guide us through this session today, I am delighted to extend a warm welcome to Hendrik and Caroline. They are our panelists today on this conversation. Hendrik is a fellow at the Center for Studies of Contemporary Solidarity at the University of Vienna, an adjunct professor at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. Caroline also is an award winning critical designer, a researcher, and an artist. She is also the co founder and executive director of Human Rights Research and Technology Lab. So, before we begin to look at the topic, I would like Caroline and Edric to give us an overview of the topic and also share their thoughts about what they think about this topic. So, to open the floor for us is Edric Wagner.
Thank you, Yvonne, for this wonderful introduction. And I'm not sure what to add to it. I can maybe say that for those who are visually impaired, that I look like and I am an old white boomer, male boomer. And I worked all my life as a policy scholar. I was always interested in what we call in policy studies wicked problems, very hard to solve problems like prostitution policy, often morally controversial, mental health policy, disadvantaged neighborhoods. I approach those topics with a mixture of very careful, almost ethnographic empirical research and action research. So I wanted to end up with solutions to those problems, obviously. At the moment, I live and work in Vienna. I love it there. And at the Center for the Study of Contemporary Solidarity. And I'm involved in a big project of the Austrian Academy of Sciences on democracy in digital society. So I will focus a bit on that aspect of the digital dystopia that we seem to have entered at the moment. So without further ado, uh, I think my first point is that it's very, very difficult to understand what's going on in the field of social media, artificial intelligence, digitalization in general, robotics, for example, uh, without understanding its political economy. And the political economy of AI, let's make that a kind of shorthand for all those developments. The political economy of AI is driven by the logic of venture capital. Now, you have to think here, and you might have read it in the paper or on your websites that you follow. Uh, Venture capitalists in the States and other countries, they invest at the moment tens and hundreds of billions of dollars in gigantic market capitalizations that result in gigantic market capitalizations of large tech companies. AI, for example, is now valued at 500 billion. And also smaller startups that have never even shown anything, let alone a profit. And that money, you have to realize, has to be recouped after they go to the stock exchange, an IPO, that's called initial public offering of the company. So the emphasis of this whole complex, this financial complex, is always on market capture. So you want the company in which you invest to become a monopolist, more or less, and on the speed of return on investment. So keep that in mind, whatever you read about AI and other digital developments. Now, and this is my second point, venture capital requires what you could call the right fiscal laws and industry regulation. And I put right in the quotation marks. So, for example, in the United States, the profits on investments in startups are not taxed. So any profit you make via your investment through a startup is you can put on your bank account in the Virgin Islands. And under the banner of free speech, the regulation of social media platforms, a large language model, is either very weak or very absent. It's quite different, by the way, in Europe, where I'm based. So differently put, the digital industry requires a particular kind of corporate state alliance. And it's very important to keep in mind that the state is really completely implicated in this whole tech industry. There's no blueprint for this alliance, though, so it's being designed on the run, as it were. Its instruments are, in addition to what I already said, direct financial participation by the state. We see that a lot, or some of its officials, like Trump, investing in cryptocurrency. Local bank loans, loans to local banks to get them to channel funds into tech investment, local government support, the creation of university campuses, plus associated funding to attract bright AI researchers. All this is happening, particularly in China at the moment. So this is an interesting other element of the tech alliance, the tech state alliance, that it is independent of political regime. Now, what does it all mean for democracy? A short definition of democracy is that no decision must be taken without the influence of affected groups. That's number one. And number two, that the capacity for reasoned and informed debate about social and political issues must be available in society. So that's why, for example, we have the protection of civil rights, and we have the right to assemble. We have the importance of independent quality media and availability of good education for everyone. Now, according to these criteria, the development of digital technology is highly undemocratic. Decisions are in the hands of a small number of unelected corporate actors, and reasoned debate is actively curtailed by the bias and the polarizing effects of social media platforms. In fact, some commentators speak of a totalizing an ecosystem of material infrastructure, biased algorithms, and public discourse to characterize this corporate financial political complex. Now, this corporate political alliance easily descends into a kind of cyber-fascistic program. And it's hard to make that connection, but has something to do with the sheer money power of the tech bosses, which compels them to promote and realize very dubious schemes, so such as secession into non-regulated territories. They call that the network state. So where the tech elite can withdraw and without being hindered by laws or financial regulation or and so on and so on. And this is not an idea. This is already being put in effect and not always successful, but they keep going. Um, uh, um, you also see alliances of the tech bosses with extremist religious groups. So they also actively intervene in the democratic process of other countries. So when Elon Musk berates European governments that they are selling out to Muslim migrants, or they try to capture central banks to facilitate cryptocurrencies. Now, what you see, and that's so sort of fascinating, I'm always fascinated by how things are presented in the media. You see a kind of steady stream of reporting on the heady numbers games of this venture capital AI industry that is presented as a kind of Olympian sport. 50 billion is invested, 100 billion is invested. It will be a 2 trillion billion industry, 2 trillion industry. So but that obscures very much the negative effects of many digital technologies, their society altering impact, and the structures of oppression and exploitation on which the industry is built. So I can say a little bit about that if I still have time. Um, well, first of all, the business model of AI, for example, and I'm keeping an eye on Yvonne.
Yes, I would actually come back to you, Hendrik.
Okay, all right,
Yes,
then let's stop
thank
here.
you very much.
Okay, I'll bring those points up in the discussion then later.
All right,
All right.
awesome. You can turn off your camera
Yeah, I
now.
will do
I
that.
would like
Thank
to
you.
now welcome Caroline to join me on the screen. Hello, Caroline. Please turn on your camera and unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hi, Caroline. So
Hi.
I'm yielding the mic to you now to give us a self-description of yourself and also just touch on the topic.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I will also do my best to be as brief as possible, but I wrote down quite a few notes. But yeah, my name is Caroline Cinders. I'm a human rights researcher, activist, and artist. I'm the executive director and co-founder of Convocation Research and Design. We are a think tank and service provider. We believe that security and privacy are human rights, and we work on manifesting that through a variety of research, security services, and data storytelling. Um, and some of the work that I've done personally has been working with groups that are trying to circumvent internet censorship in Russia. I look at also threats to internet freedom, both as human rights defenders and journalists are targeted, as well as activists. But I also look at varying aspects of digital violence, particularly online gender-based violence and technology-facilitated violence. Again, looking at how those are elements of targeting the free press and human rights defenders, but then also aspects, again, of the general public. And I think it's important to sort of talk about that and sort of talk about the role, let's say, of technology facilitated violence, both as a way to silence activists, but also, opposition to any kind of authoritarian government. And really briefly, I also want to talk a little bit about our role at my lab in terms of digital security work, since a lot of that work has been particularly picking up within the US. We run a variety of different types of security services, from trainings to rapid response to thinking about data retention policies. And a lot of the work we've been doing recently has been advising nonprofits on how to best utilize different types of privacy mechanisms to protect their staff, their board, their volunteers, and generally their community. And a lot of that, again, is sort of coming from recent, let's say, events inside the United States. And I think this is a good time to then dovetail into my other points, because it's an interesting time as an American to talk about cyberfascism. Cyberfascism and, let's say, generally fascism as a concept are obviously not new, just might feel new to some Americans, let's say, with who are dominating social media. But cyberfascism has existed for many, many years, and aspects of it have been utilized by many governments against their people, including the US, not just against their own people, but again, intervening internationally against other countries and their communities. I think it's important to point out that role of the US, as a colonialistic and imperialistic power, but also one as like a military power that does intervene quite frequently, right? Um, but I just wanted to sort of highlight that when we think of cyberfascism, elements are not new, right? It's not a new concept. Um, and so I think we can look at like these sort of elements generally of fascism. And, at a high level, that could be support of extreme nationalism and national identity, support of the military and violence. And I think digitally, we could see the support of, let's say, firewalls, right, of blocking and censoring access to specific websites, of throttling an internet connection or blocking connection entirely to the internet, as we see with internet shutdowns. All of those are forms of cyber fascism and cyber authoritarianism. And I would say that that is that manifestation of that extreme military violence online. Similarly, classic examples of state-sponsored meme farms, state-sponsored sock puppet accounts, right? Those are fake accounts that sort of appear to enact like human accounts. are also manifestations of this military violence, but online. And, you know, again, we see with these sock puppet accounts, pushing ideological narratives that support the authoritarian government and harm marginalized communities within that country and external to that country. So in a way, we can think of authoritarianism and fascism as going hand in hand because they do. Because what I'm describing here, right, is both. Fascism is the ideology of authoritarianism, and authoritarianism is the manifestation of fascism, but via the government or governmental powers, right? So within that, fascism is this ideology of authoritarianism. And relatedly, I want to talk about some of the tools that we've been noticing of authoritarian regimes. And part of this, again, is to install fear in the public. And I'll be using a few US examples from the current administration just because they're new and there are things that have been happening in the past few weeks. So, for example, we see the current US presidential administration informing US military leaders to treat US cities as training grounds, as military training grounds. So that expansive and utilization of military as power and a tool directly of their government, right, but against its own citizens, treating them as outsiders, as obstacles, as others. You know, we also see this from different embassies abroad and within the country, putting out notices that for those seeking visas will have their social media checked for any anti-American sentiment. What that means is not defined. You know, is posting, let's say, in support of immigration rights anti-American? Is posting about free press anti-American? Is talking about pro-Palestinian activists being grabbed off the streets in Boston and being held at immigration detention centers with a threat of deportation simply for vocalizing support of Palestine anti-American, right? And again, undefined, but often implied. And so what this leads, right, is to the direct censoring of one's speech, effectively eliminating what one could argue as free speech. So that self-censorship, that silencing is coming from very much is coming from choices the current administration is making. And this is a threat to free speech and the human right of being able to express oneself. The current administration has also recently published an executive order labeling Antifa as a terrorist organization. And with that came further scrutiny of nonprofits and funders for those who fund Antifa related activities. But it's not clear, what does the current administration deem as Antifa activities? Is it purely anti-fascism work? And I share this because a lot of these regulations create ambiguity and chaos, and I think that's the goal. It's not clear whose social media will be checked. Will it be everyone's? What does it mean for those currently? What does it mean for those who are current visa holders within the United States? What does it mean to citizens who are married or in community with visa holders? Again, it is not clear. It's not clear which US cities will be treated as training grounds. Will it be cities whose governors oppose Trump or whose cities whose governors also welcome Trump? It's not clear which nonprofits, researchers, and activists will be targeted, again, with Antifa related activities. But again, this ambiguity is part of the strategy. Who will be targeted will most likely be the left and any opponent or oppositional voice of the current administration. So again, we see how this is a manifestation of authoritarianism, and the tools here to implement these directives will come from technology. And if they're not directly about our digital spheres, they will spread there. So again, this is this manifestation directly of cyber fascism. Who will build these tools? Most likely big tech companies who have already started to prove themselves in some ways complicit with the current administration. Those will often probably be the key builders of achieving these directives. So as a human rights researcher, this is where some of the work that my lab is doing on digital security is becoming even more necessary. You know, again, to support nonprofits, their staff, activists, but also communities generally who want to be able to express opposition to any of these directives. Yvonne, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I just wanted to check really quickly.
Okay, so you can wrap up in 30 seconds.
Okay. I did want to talk about some of my activist work, but I think that we can get into that in the Q&A. But there's also other elements we get into of cyber fascism. What are digital design elements we see? You know, in early 2020, we saw sort of the rise of um, what we called Fash Wave, or the sort of very popularized graphics that were hot pink and blue. Right now, we're seeing also a rise of what one could argue AI slop, but a lot of design that's sort of being supported by the current administration is also being remixed, reused, and referenced also by far-right groups, including white supremacists and white nationalists within the US. So again, also design, this might seem minor, but a design of the graphics you see people using, the types of typography, those are now also, one could argue, sort of becoming dog whistles. They're referencing each other. In terms of how intentional that reference is, we will see.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I hear you clearly. So a bit of highlight from the introduction that Caroline and Edric has given is that the digital industry requires states alliance. No decision should be made or taken without the decision of the people or group directly affected. And also she spoke about the role that civil society play in ensuring digital security. Thank you very much again, Caroline. Hendrik, you can turn on your camera. I don't see you right now. I don't know if you dropped off.
Yeah, I'm here.
And turn on your camera. Okay, thank you very much. We will now move to the second part of today's dialogue and provide the opportunities for speakers to ask questions to one another based on their opening inputs. Caroline and Edric, could you please ensure your cameras are on and you are unmuted?
Yes, we are. I
Okay.
am.
Okay, so in this session, you'll be asking each other questions based on your opening remark. But also, again, we really want to know, what do we mean now by cyber fascism and what has changed in the last 2 years? I think it's a good place for both of you to begin the conversation.
Yeah, I have a question for Caroline. Thank you for this wonderful set of talking points. If I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, so we talk of cyber fascism, but we'll see there are in a way two different things. Like on the one hand, you have authoritarian regimes, fascist regimes even, and on the other hand, you have this huge ballooning tech industry. Now, how do the two come together so so that we can actually talk about cyber fascism as if one cannot live without the other?
Mhm.
And I think that's not an easy question to answer. So, but I raise it as a talking point again.
And that's interesting because I had something similar, but asking you maybe more specifically about AI as in terms of this sort of manifestation of AI, again, really coming from big tech, but being sort of placed into so many products in people's everyday lives.
Yeah.
How do we also think of, yeah, with some of what you were touching on, uh, I guess, this sort of role of AI and perhaps its utilization by different governments as a further form of authoritarianism and cyber fascism?
Well, one thing I think we should always keep in mind is that I gave two characteristics, two qualities of what a democracy is, and one is, of course, you shouldn't make decisions without the people that are being affected by it. But the other one is as important, if not more, almost, that we have an ability and a capacity in civic society to reason with each other about issues, right, in an open way. And that's being hugely undermined at the moment. So we see in all countries, I'm Dutch, I see that in my own little country, the society is so incredibly polarized. Everybody who disagrees with you is so immediately demonized that there is no discussion anymore. And in fact, it erupts very quickly in violence and extreme violence. So we had our own raid on parliament 2 weeks ago, and by extreme right groups, and just because they were clearly called to do this by some right-wing ideologues on the internet. And so I think that's one strong connection, and that very much chimes with, for example, the use of the propaganda ministry in Nazi Germany of the radio. Radio was at that time a very advanced technology, and it could reach every household. So there's a lot of similarities there. We talked to before we started this, we talked a little bit about it would be a very good idea to study the history of the Weimar Republic, but that was part of that history. That's one thing. The other thing is that you mentioned, but you know more about it than I do, that there is a lot in the design of social media and of AI that tilts us towards this kind of authoritarian practices. But maybe you can say more about that, sort of the algorithmic design.
Yeah, and also just thinking a little bit of your previous question as well. I mean, I think, one of the hard things when we do think of sort of the furthering, let's say, of the technology's role in furthering cyber fascism, which I think I can also sort of dovetail into talking about social media also, is that, we're using social media, and I mean this to sort of say that there's not a lot we can do necessarily right now as users. We're sort of at the behest of these companies in a way. And I also just want to sort of call out that's what I think is so important when we see regulation come out of Europe, like the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the European AI Act, the forthcoming Digital Fairness Act, and even regulation also we see in the UK, the online safety bill, though there are some elements of that bill I don't like. But this ability to try to curb, or at least like reshape social media in a way that does benefit users, right? Versus how social media currently is, in which like decisions are made inside of this company, right, that then impact all the users of it. There's another argument to be had of, is it good that we sort of use social media as a form, one could argue, of a social infrastructure? If we think of the sort of social fabric and community ties that play out on something, let's say, like a Facebook or like YouTube or like TikTok or like Instagram, and that's probably a conversation for another time. Because what I will say is like people are using those tools, right? And that people are having meaningful connections within those tools. And those tools, again, form what we could think of as a social infrastructure, as a community infrastructure, because it's utilized by folks, right? But then also in some ways, we live in a modern society. So I'm sure many folks know that putting your work online, so using something like LinkedIn or Instagram or Blue Sky or Twitter, right, or Facebook or YouTube or really any platform, is also a part of your work, if not directly a part of it, right? To share findings from a paper you worked on, to engage with others, right? Sometimes using that also at times as a research tool, et cetera. And so we're really, again, I want to sort of emphasize like at the behest of these companies and sort of decisions that those companies make, right? And so one of the things I thought a little bit about, having worked in trust and safety for over a decade and thinking about technology facilitated violence, is that there hasn't been really that much regulation to force companies into having sort of the structure, let's say, of trust and safety teams per se, right? We could argue with the online safety bill, yes, but there was nothing that sort of said that Twitter had to have a trust and safety team. And so on one hand, we got very lucky that there were these establishments of trust and safety teams. I think they're also natural business decisions because they are things that are needed. But I'm, again, emphasizing this just to sort of say that, these are also decisions that the company made. And often those decisions, one could argue, are to further a bottom line. If you have sort of bad content on a platform, be it digital violence or spam or fraud, right, or content that users just don't really want to see, they will not return to that platform, right? And so in a way, again, one could think of things like safety mechanisms were a part of, or are a part of, a bottom line to encourage users to stay. Users will not stay where they don't feel safe, right? But again, these are decisions that one could argue that like companies make, right?
Yeah.
So I think in a way, like those basic elements of design, we could argue are sort of like are overreaching decisions. But I think to like sort of your later question, there have been lots of studies on how recommendation algorithms will push different types of popularized content. That content will be or can be incredibly harmful. It can be full of mis and disinformation. There's been work that's been done to really illustrate how, especially on, let's say, apps like YouTube, for example, where you start watching one video and then it will suddenly start recommending more and more and more. And that recommendation does become, in some ways, one could argue, a part of the pipeline of radicalization. Um, so I think, like, in a way, we could think of a recommendation algorithm as a part of the design element, right? That it is
Mhm.
sure and a key feature of the platforms, and then it does become a conduit for pushing all different types of content. A recommendation algorithm, I think, a little bit in my mind, is somewhat, I would say, I don't want to say content neutral, but it's not necessarily sort of saying, oh, this is radicalized and thus we should radicalize people, but it's recommending content, right? It doesn't really know what the content is. But again, that's still the fault of the platform for having that content there, right? And allowing that content to be shared and spread. So in a way, like, there is this sort of culpability, but they are also, right, this space, and one could argue a breeding ground of where folks engage with all of these different types of ideas.
Yeah, that's very, very important. But also in a way, it's how do I put this? In policy studies, we make a distinction between upstream measures and downstream measures. So
Yeah.
regulation of tech companies, as we do it in the EU, is an upstream measure. You regulate the negative effects as much as you can. And you hope then that either through fines or through nudging, that the tech companies will change their ways. But it's also important to look at what happens downstream. And there's a lot of things I think we can sort of uh, use as levers maybe to change. So first of all, much of the production of AI rests on very, very harmful practices that can be summarized as blatant exploitation, often with a colonial dimension. Exploitation of labor, often in the southern hemisphere. Well, there you can do something, right? And things are happening. Unionization of all these underpaid and overworked people who have to scan content for violence or sexual improprieties, or sometimes just looking image by image for images of cars so that you can design a safe large language model for driverless cars. Um, but we also see the exploitation of natural resources, so the huge amounts of water and energy that are required for the large data centers. In fact, so much that if you follow the projections, we run into a brick wall quite soon. There's just not that much energy and water around. And do we want to use that for large data centers, for something like AI? I'll come back to that. Of course, we also see the what I was always call the seductions of surveillance. You have the data, so you can use those data to keep an eye on people that you want to keep an eye on. That can be ethnic minorities or political dissidents, and it happens all the time. It can be ordinary citizens, actually. Um, but also, you use those surveillance mechanisms to categorize people, and that again that undermines this very ability to have this reasoned debate in civic society about all sorts of political issues or social issues. So these are, like I said, levers that are maybe much more effective in changing those industries, or maybe creating even new industries. And there comes my final point here. I'm always very sensitive to how social problems are framed. You know, the way you frame a problem already sort of predicts the kind of solution you. Often it's the other way around. Actually, you have a solution, and that's how you frame the problem. Then, to get to that solution. And nowadays, nobody questions the framing of the big tech industries about social technologies, digital technologies. Nobody. We accept their version of it, and we keep talking about, for example, something like AGI, so general intelligence or super intelligence or whatnot. And it's a very weird, almost surrealistic debate that we're having. Well, partly dystopian, partly utopian, and it's often the same people or some, tech bosses. So Sam Altman talks from one side of his mouth dystopian, and in the other side utopian. Almodar from what is it, Anthropic, is always the optimistic utopian, and he says, well, within 2 years we live in paradise and have solved all climate problems and illnesses. But my point is, we could also have another debate, another framing. Maybe tools like language models, which is an incredible technical achievement. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to be a Luddite and that get all this technology out of the world. On the contrary, but we could use it differently. Maybe not on such a grand scale. Maybe much more within our own everyday world where we have problems that we want to solve, group problems. So I think changing that framing would be a very, very important task for everybody who's critical and concerned about these developments in the tech world at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for that. And there's so many juicy points to respond to. I mean, I think one thing I often think about in the internet freedom community is that there are so many voices that are challenging technology companies and their narrative and how their tech is built. Like, I think a lot about the work in New York from the EFF, Dia Kali, who is a fantastic thinker and researcher and policy expert. I think a lot about the work of Chain in the UK of really, researching digital violence and also challenging and holding, really trying to hold companies accountable. I think of the work, let's say, of like Foxglove, where they're working with Kenyan moderators, right, to try to be able to sue big tech companies. Again, there's so many more. You could see like the work of Access Now, MC International, the work that my lab does, Convocation Research and Design. I think that there's, PIN America as well. There's just so many organizations, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue being another. I mean, like the list really could go on, right? Bits of Freedom in the Netherlands, one I'm a big fan of. And so I think there are all these groups that are using many different mechanisms to try to hold social media companies accountable through many different means, right? And depending upon where one is based, there's different, let's say, regulatory aspects you can use. That is, again, where I sort of turn back to some European regulation. And I'm saying that partially because I used to live in Europe and I really appreciated living in Europe and having technology regulation, where we think of GDPR, both in the UK and in the EU. Now, there are some downsides to GDPR. We ended up with cookie banners. It's not the fault of that regulation, but rather the fault of how companies chose to interpret it, right? Mm-hmm. But again, thinking about what is again like the right we have as an individual to sort of see the information gathered about us, to have a choice, let's say, in how it's utilized, to have it removed, for example. Those are things that might seem minor, but again, if we think of them in a larger context of something like social media or of surveillance, those then are actual, I would say, like very important elements, right? What we're thinking about is we're thinking about what is our right to privacy. Well, also, what is our right to how we are perceived or not perceived or labeled. And I think those are things that, again, many civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations are thinking about. And so I do just want to say that. But I mean, I think it is hard, right? Like social media companies can make a choice, and then there's the reaction period, right, where one could argue social media or regulators respond, right? So they look at the choice, they sort of look at what's available, and they sort of issue a response. And maybe in some cases this does lead to things like new regulation, right, to try to curb those harms. One could argue that this is a bit of a whack-a-mole. I am I'm in my late 30s, so I'm like young, probably compared to others, but older in comparison to,
Certainly compared to me.
well, I'd say like probably older than compared to like Generation Z or
Yeah.
Alpha. because I am not in those generations. But I mean, I would assume that these are also things that we could look for other industries where this is true. Like something is launched, a harm arises, and like regulation follows. It can be hard, I think, to sort of imagine what technology could be 10 years from now and to write regulation about that. And that I'm sure many lawyers would be like, don't do that. Because again, you just don't know how it's being formulated, right? But one thing, I mean, I do sort of want to touch on is more of like my own like political beliefs as one who is very anti-surveillance. Is the core work that we try to do is help folks be safe online when they can be. And so often this really is a battle against the tools, if you will. There are like many things that social media companies could implement today that would make the general public, but journalists and activists and human rights defenders more so, even more safe. And those are choices that those companies, again, are just not necessarily making. And I think a lot of them come back to sort of this anti-privacy sort of design that they take, right? By sort of requiring as much personal information as possible, by sort of tracking and storing as much data as possible, when often that data is not useful for making insights, right? It's just almost like too much data in a way. But sort of the capture and storage of everything, of sort of turning on every feature that exposes so many people to harm. And it also creates this massive amount of cognitive burden to be able to navigate those systems to understand, well, what is being tracked about you and what is findable about you. It is a lot of effort an individual has to do. And so I always like to say, or like to remind folks that it's not their fault when they face digital harassment or digital violence. This is how the tools are designed. The tools are facilitating the violence happening, right? And those are decisions, if not intentional decisions, they're still decisions. A bug is a feature until you fix it, right? And so these, again, are choices inside of these tools. And I think it's always important to like emphasize that these are choices tool makers have made.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Such a great way to wrap up your point. So we have some questions in the chat box that we would attempt to answer, and this is to both of you. Do you think regulation on tech companies will solve all the problems mentioned here? We've spoken about design by safety, we've spoken about disinformation. This person wants to know, how can we avoid these harms that comes with using technology as civil society organization? I think Edric can go first, and thereafter Caroline can attempt to contribute to the answer.
Yeah, I'm happy. You can also go first, Caroline, if you want.
No, feel free. I can jump
Okay,
in.
okay. Well, I always, in terms of regulation, I try to understand and look at earlier instances of regulation. So, for example, the car industry was in the, let's say, the 50s and probably early 60s, a very, very unsafe industry. So driving a car in those days was a lot more risky than it is today, even though there are many, many more cars on the road. And what happened was that through consumer pressure, through regulatory pressure, the car industry began to internalize safety features. And not only that, they began to be competitive on what was, which car had the most safety features. I mean, I remember Volvo coming as the first car with doors that were reinforced on the side, so that in a sideways collision, you could have higher chances to survive. I don't see anything like that in the tech industry, and also I didn't see anything like that in the tobacco industry or the oil industry, for example. So I don't know what that means. If that means maybe there are good industries and there are bad industries, but it's an interesting thing to think about. But in fact, the tech industry operates on a very different principle of number of clicks and the profits that can be made that way. So I'm actually quite pessimistic if regulation can solve all of these problems, and it certainly can't solve the downstream problems that I mentioned, with all the exploitation, extraction, and biases in the very essence of the algorithms. Now, again, I think we should try to find an alternative route. And Caroline mentioned a couple already, where we not only criticize the tech industry, but start to use language models, and I leave out a large here, to use language models as tools for solving everyday problems in communities. And there are examples of that worldwide by now. So, yeah, that would be my answer. I don't want to take up more time.
Thank you. And I agree with like Hendrik's answer that I don't think regulation will solve everything. But I do think like continuing to regulate technology companies and technology generally,
Yeah.
like I'm super pro that.
Me too, by the way.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think as like your answer was touching on that, once regulation is passed, like a company will respond to it and they will interpret it in many ways they see possible. I've been a part of some recent European Commission complaints related to a big tech company. I did some of the investigations on it. Part of what I also do at Convocation is I look at, again, very explicitly design's role in causing harm through a subset or an area called dark patterns or deceptive design patterns. I call them harmful design patterns. And they are mentioned in the DSA. And I believe that they are being like further mentioned in the Digital Fairness Act. And so, I'm looking at, again, this sort of very explicit role design has in impeding user agency, user choice, and user consent, right? And so, let's say when something is passed, GDPR is a good example, but there's elements of like the Digital Service Act around recommender systems, right? Of providing alternatives to those. Well, how many of you see alternatives in the social media you use? How easy is it for you to set a non-recommender system as your um, main feed? It's really, really hard. Some platforms are doing pretty okay. LinkedIn, surprisingly, actually is one of them. But a lot of platforms are not, right? And so that is a way in which like regulation sort of outlined, one could argue, a directive, provide an alternative, and then the manifestation, is not, let's say, perhaps being met in good faith, right? And so this is where, I think then there's this sort of I don't know what you'd call it, but I think of it as like the friction or the rocky road of how that regulation is implemented, where companies are sort of trying to do the minimal amount of work, and that is where civil society, NGOs, and regulators come in to sort of then take those companies to task to then sort of show, well, this is what it looks like, but in terms of can regulation try to impact things, let's say like mis and disinformation or technology facilitated violence? I mean, I think I would hope so. I think that there are like issues when we think about how that's being sort of handled. Again, I speak from my own bias of having worked in trust and safety. I used to work on the anti-harassment team at the Wikimedia Foundation. Wikipedia is a social network. While also being a knowledge source. But, I think, again, from this personal bias as a former trust and safety worker, you need large trust and safety teams. You need content moderation teams who can have the time to be trained, who can also have access to dealing with trauma. Content moderators are looking at some of the worst content online, right? And these are a part of how we would mitigate or tackle different types of technology facilitated violence in terms of harmful content, right? Like these things go hand in hand with regulation. But what we're seeing is like the dismantling of content moderation teams. We're seeing trust and safety teams being shrunk radically in size, right? Like currently. And that, like, those are very much a part of the sort of wider problem, right? The wider problem of harmful content, let's say online. You need these teams.
All right.
Yeah, sorry,
Thank
go ahead.
you, Caroline. I want us to attempt one more question because we are almost out of time. There is a question here that says, is techno-authoritarianism inevitable, or can society build techno-democracies instead? So this is a very important question I think we can attempt to answer. Anyone can go first.
Caroline, you want to go?
Hendrik, please feel free because I just did a lot of talking, so I'm
Okay.
fine for you.
Well, yeah. I think we can do that, but again, we need to work very hard on how we frame the use of these digital technologies in our society. So first of all, we need to start thinking about digital technology for all, and not just for the rich Western countries, but also countries where the electricity is not always available, or where people don't have enough money to buy the latest model Apple laptop. At what I'm so that that then we need to think of how to realize such digital technologies that can be used in places where those conditions are not met. And and as I said, I've said it now several times, but I want to repeat it. um, there are so many, we don't have a good understanding of how AI or is now actually used in everyday life. And I don't mean by everyday life my life or our life of everybody who's here. That's important too. And I can tell you a bit about how I use it, but it wouldn't be so interesting. I also think of, for example, small businesses or communities who have needs. I worked a lot with, as I said in my short introduction, with disadvantaged neighborhoods, and I've seen some of the most creative and important initiatives and projects there to manage those environments, difficult urban environments, far beyond what any public administration or could come up with themselves. Now, such groups also have a need for such technologies, and they could use them very well, but not necessarily the large language models of OpenAI or Anthropic. So that discussion, I think, and you mentioned a few organizations that are engaged in at least holding tech companies to account, but we also need a discussion, a more design-oriented discussion, a more positive discussion of how can we do it differently
Totally.
according to the needs of ordinary people, as I always call them. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that last point because that's something I have like tried to get support and like funding to research. Something I've tried to do as a project over the past few years has been to like co-design what what would be a feminist social network.
Yeah.
And so I think to the point of the question of like, you know, can we have technology without digital authoritarianism? I think absolutely. I mean, I do really reflect on my time at Wikimedia. Wikipedia as a space and Wikimedia Commons as a space is not perfect. There is toxicity, there is like bias in there, but like I think it is an example of, right, um, of how sort of how technology can be built to support a community and how a community also has a say in the technology. It is not perfect. It is not at all a perfect model. I will be the first one to say that. But I do think it's possible. And I would really love to see if this is possible from Europe or from other geographical regions, like any sort of type of you know, funding and support on sort of imagining these new technology futures, right? That maybe are not built as capitalistic companies or commercial companies, right? But support for building alternatives and support for also researching and imagining alternatives. So when I say like, what is a feminist social network? I mean all of that. I mean, what is a feminist social network for the employees of the social network, right? So the way we have content moderation would not work, right? What is a feminist social network in terms of design of UX and UI? That might seem really like minor, but I think that that's actually very major. How will people access features, right? What does it look like and feel like? I don't think it would look like anything we currently have. And I don't mean this as like just a purely philosophical project. I mean, this is something we actually would need to invest in to understand how social media could be better, right? And what are starting points from that?
Yeah. So yeah, so I think we both are guardedly optimistic in answer to your question, Yvonne. But certainly there is a program here that we can all engage in, I think. All.
Yes, thank you very much, Edric and Caroline, for answering all our questions today on digital dialogue. I would attempt to share some highlights that we've discussed today. We've discussed about who decide what is acceptable behavior in the digital space, because some people also believe that there is a certain control that is needed to keep everyone safe. But however, we looked at how technology can be built to support our communities, how AI can be understood, on about how AI affect our daily lives, and what are the threats that AI poses to all of us as individuals and communities. We also spoke about safety by design, by platform, and also the need to begin to question big tech, to have language models that solve everyday community problems and individual problems in their design. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this very important digital dialogue for the month of October. To Caroline and Edric, we say thank you for your incredible insight and discussion with us today. And for all our interpreters, we say thank you for your tireless work throughout today's session. Until we meet again on the next digital dialogue, it's bye from now.
Okay, it was my pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm so
And
honored to be here.
same here.
Bye,
So
everyone.